My husband betrayed me with another woman, sold my apartment by forging my signature while I was traveling. But what he didn't know is the deed was only in my name and now he lost everything. I'm 34 years old. I work in digital marketing for a pretty big firm. And what happened 6 months ago still feels unreal when I think about it. Like one of those stories you see in bad movies but never think will actually happen to you. The thing is, I was married to Eric for 7 years, and I thought we had a pretty solid life. You know, nothing spectacular but normal, comfortable. We had our apartment in the city center, 2 cars, we traveled a couple times a year, all very professional middle class. Eric worked in finance, made good money, and I contributed my part too. We met in college, dated for like 4 years before getting married, and honestly, I thought I knew him well. I guess that was my first mistake, thinking you really know someone. The first years were good, or at least that's what it seemed like to me. We went out with friends, made plans together, had our routines. Sure, there were things that bothered me, like how Eric always put his work first and sometimes disappeared into his phone for hours. But I thought it was normal, that all marriages have those little things. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. You know? The signs were there. He started coming home later, taking more business trips, being more distant when we were together. But I was so caught up in my own work routine that I basically let all of that slide. My best friend Bethany would tell me something weird was going on, that Eric was acting different, but I ignored her because I didn't want to see the obvious. The apartment. And this is important to understand the whole story. We bought it together like 5 years ago. Well, technically, I bought it with money from my inheritance when my grandmother died, but Eric and I were already married, so we put it in both our names. About a year and a half ago, we decided to refinance because interest rates had dropped quite a bit, and it turns out that for some reason, with the bank, I don't know the exact technical details, but it had to do with my credit versus Eric's. The new loan and the deed ended up solely in my name. Eric was fine with it at the time because we were still married anyway and legally shared everything, or so we both thought. I never imagined that administrative detail would be what saved me later. Everything exploded in February of this year. I was in San Francisco for an industry conference, one of those 3-day things full of boring panels and forced networking, and Eric was supposedly in Chicago for work. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I was in my hotel room checking some emails after the day's sessions when he called. I remember it perfectly because it was raining outside and I had the window open. I could hear the city traffic and the sound of the rain. I answered, expecting a normal call. Like, how was your day? Or what are your plans for dinner? But what I heard was completely different. Eric didn't even say hello. He started right away with, "We need to talk, Lauren." And I felt that emptiness in my stomach because nobody says that if they're going to give good news. I said, "What's wrong?" And he just let it all out at once, like he'd been rehearsing the speech. He told me he wanted a divorce, that he'd met someone else, that he wasn't happy with me anymore, and that he'd made the decision to start a new life. That alone was devastating. You know what I mean? 7 years of marriage ending with a phone call while I was thousands of miles away. But then came the part that still makes my blood boil when I remember it. He said, "Oh, and I already sold the apartment. I signed all the papers yesterday. Shannon, my new partner, and I need the money to start our life together. The buyer already paid the down payment and we're closing the sale in 2 weeks." I was literally speechless, like I couldn't even process what I'd just heard. I said, "You're joking, right?" And he very calmly responded that no, he was serious. That anyway, in the divorce, we were going to have to sell the apartment and split the money, so he just got ahead of it to make things easier for me. Make things easier for me? Can you believe it? Like selling my house without my knowledge while I was traveling was some favor he was doing me. That's when something in me activated. I stopped feeling sadness or shock and started feeling a rage like I'd never experienced before. I asked him how exactly he'd sold the apartment if the deed was in my name, and there was silence on the other end. A long silence that told me everything I needed to know. Finally, Eric said he'd signed the papers for both of us, that he had copies of my ID and had forged my signature on the documents. He said it was simpler that way. That anyway, I was going to receive my part of the money eventually. I yelled at him that that was illegal, that it was fraud, and he hung up on me. He just hung up. I sat there in that hotel room feeling completely destroyed for like 5 minutes, but then my brain started working. Again. The first thing I thought was, I need to call Allison. Allison is my lawyer. Well, she started as my lawyer, but we became friends over the years. She handled the original purchase of the apartment and then the refinancing. I called her even though it was almost 8 at night, and luckily she answered. I told her everything that had just happened, talking super fast because I was between furious and on the verge of tears, and she told me, "Lauren, breathe. This is good. Good for you, I mean." She explained that since the apartment deed was solely in my name since the refinancing, Eric had no legal right to sell it, and any sale he'd tried to make was completely invalid and fraudulent. Allison told me to stay calm, that she was going to take care of everything. She had me email her all the documents I had for the apartment, including the updated deed from the refinancing, and told me that the next day she was going to contact the supposed buyer and notify them that the sale was illegal. She also told me to take the rest of my trip easy, that this was going to take a few days, but that she had everything under control. Honestly, I don't know how I managed to sleep that night. I don't think I really slept. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how my marriage had imploded in a 15-minute call, and how the man I'd shared 7 years of my life with had literally tried to steal my house. The next 2 days in San Francisco were torture. I had to attend the conference sessions and pretend everything was fine. While inside, I felt like I was falling apart. Bethany, who was also at the conference, immediately noticed something was wrong. We sat at the hotel bar after the first day, and I told her everything. She was furious. More furious than me at that moment, I think. She told me she'd always thought Eric was an idiot, but never imagined he'd go that far. She accompanied me the rest of the conference basically as my emotional bodyguard, making sure I ate and didn't lock myself in my room to cry. Allison worked fast. By Thursday, she'd already contacted the supposed buyer's lawyer and sent them all the documentation, proving the sale was fraudulent. Turns out the buyer, a man about 50 years old who wanted the apartment for his son, had no idea that Eric had forged documents. When his lawyer explained the situation, he got furious with Eric, obviously, because he'd lost time and money in the process. His lawyer contacted Allison, and they said they were going to proceed with legal action against Eric for fraud, but understood I had nothing to do with it. The down payment Eric had received, like $50,000, he would now have to return or face criminal charges. I flew back home on Saturday morning, a long flight from San Francisco, where I basically did nothing but think about what I was going to say to Eric when I saw him. Allison had advised me to stay calm, not to do anything impulsive, but honestly, I didn't know if I'm able to control myself. When I got to the apartment, Eric wasn't there. He'd left a note in the kitchen saying he'd temporarily moved in with Shannon and would come later for his things. I sat on the living room couch, our couch where we'd watched movies together, where we'd had conversations about our future, and I cried. I cried for hours. I think, for everything I'd lost and for how stupid I felt for not having seen the signs. But after crying came determination. I called Allison and told her I wanted to move everything as fast as possible. She'd already prepared a temporary restraining order for Eric, preventing him from entering the apartment without my consent, and had started the divorce papers. She'd also notified the police about the forged signature fraud, though she told me that was going to be a longer process. The important thing was that the apartment was completely secured as my property and Eric couldn't touch it. Eric tried calling me like 20 times that weekend. I didn't answer. Finally, on Sunday night, I sent him a very simple text message. "Talk to my lawyer. I have nothing to say to you." He responded with a long message saying I was overreacting, that he'd only tried to make things easier, that he and Shannon really needed that money for their new life. The audacity of this guy. Seriously? I responded, "You forged my signature, Eric. That's a crime. And the only thing I'm going to tell you is that if you want your stuff from the apartment, you have to coordinate with Allison, because I'm not going to see or talk to you directly." About a week and a half passed where everything went through lawyers. Allison was incredible. She handled everything with an efficiency that put me at ease. The divorce papers were moving fast, because Eric really didn't have anything to fight with. He'd committed fraud, and that was documented. The apartment was legally mine. Our bank accounts were going to be divided equitably, but that was basically all we had together, besides the cars. I kept my car, obviously, and he kept his. Then came the moment that still makes me smile when I think about it. Eric finally called me from an unknown number. I guess he knew I wasn't going to answer if I saw his name. I answered without thinking. And it was him. He told me he needed to come to the apartment because Shannon wanted to see it, that she didn't believe it was as nice as he'd described, and they wanted to measure it for the new furniture they were going to buy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "Eric, the apartment isn't yours. You didn't sell it. You can't sell it. It's legally mine. He laughed. He laughed like I was being ridiculous. And told me his lawyer had said that in the divorce he was going to get half the value, so it was basically the same thing. I said, perfect. Come tomorrow at 6 in the evening. I'll be here. I hung up and immediately called Allison and Bethany. I told them what had just happened, and Allison told me she was going to be there too, that she needed a witness for whatever Eric was planning. Bethany insisted on coming too, said she wasn't going to miss this moment for anything in the world. Tuesday at 6 o'clock sharp the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there was Eric with a woman I assumed was Shannon. She was younger than me, like 28 years old I think, blonde, dressed like for a photo shoot. Eric tried to enter like nothing, but I stayed in the doorway blocking his path. Allison and Bethany were behind me. Eric said, Lauren, don't be ridiculous. Let us in. And I very calmly responded, you can come in only to get your things. You have until the end of today to take everything that's yours, or I'm going to donate it. Shannon looked at me confused and asked, excuse me, but Eric told me this apartment is ours now, that he bought it for us. I stared at her and decided she deserved to know the truth. I said, Shannon, right? Eric didn't buy this apartment. He tried to sell it illegally by forging my signature because the deed is solely in my name. He doesn't own anything here. The money he supposedly received from the sale, if he showed you anything, was a down payment that he now has to return or he's going to jail for fraud. She went pale, like completely white, and turned to look at Eric. Eric started stuttering, trying to explain, saying it was a technical misunderstanding, that his lawyer had told him he had a right to half the apartment in the divorce and that's why he'd made the sale. Shannon wasn't stupid. She interrupted him and said, you lied to me. You told me you'd legally sold your apartment and that we were going to use that money to buy our house. She said, Eric, is this true? Did you forge documents? Eric didn't know what to say. He just stood there with that face of a kid caught doing something bad. Allison, who'd been quiet until that moment, took out some papers from her briefcase and told Shannon, Miss, I don't know what Eric told you exactly, but any transaction related to this apartment that doesn't have Lauren's legitimate signature is fraudulent and criminally punishable. The original buyer already withdrew his offer and is considering pressing charges. If Eric told you or anyone else that this apartment belongs to you, it's based on false information. Shannon literally took a step back and told Eric, you're crazy. You lied to me about all of this. She turned around and left without saying anything else. Eric tried to go after her, but I blocked his path and said, you have 2 hours to get your stuff out of my apartment or I'm calling the police. Bethany and Allison stayed with me while Eric went up and down carrying boxes with his belongings. It was surreal watching him pack up his life, our 7 years together reduced to a bunch of boxes he was hurriedly putting in his car. He didn't say a single word the whole time. When he finished, like at 8 at night, he left the apartment keys on the entrance table and left. I closed the door behind him and the three of us just stood there in silence for a moment. Bethany finally said, we need wine, lots of wine, and we laughed. We laughed so much that I ended up crying again, but this time it was different. It was like a relief. The divorce papers were signed 3 weeks later. Eric didn't fight anything. His lawyer basically told him he had no case because he'd admitted to the fraud in multiple written communications. I kept the apartment, obviously. Our accounts were divided equitably, and Eric had to return the down payment he'd received from the original buyer, which basically left him with no savings. Shannon ended the relationship with him a week after our confrontation at the apartment. I guess she realized Eric wasn't the successful and trustworthy man he'd sold her. Now, 6 months later, I'm still in the same apartment, but it feels completely different. I completely redesigned it, changed the furniture, painted the walls, new colors, hired an interior decorator to help me make it feel like my space and not our space. It was cathartic, honestly, seeing how each room transformed into something that was uniquely mine. Last week, Bethany and I had a small celebration on my terrace with some friends, like a housewarming party for my new life, and while we were there, drinking cocktails and laughing, I realized I felt freer than I'd felt in years. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect now or that I didn't have difficult moments these past months. There were nights where I stayed awake wondering how I didn't see the signs, how I trusted so much in someone who turned out to be capable of doing something like that. But I also learned something important, that sometimes life puts you in situations that seem disastrous, but end up being exactly what you needed to start over. If Eric had been honest and asked for the divorce normally, I probably would have been willing to negotiate and sell the apartment. But by trying to steal my house, by forging my signature and lying to that Shannon woman, he basically gave me all the legal tools I needed to protect myself completely. The last time I knew anything about Eric was like a month ago. Bethany told me he'd moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city and was working at a different job because at his previous company they found out about the fraud and fired him. I didn't feel sorry, if I'm honest. I felt more like a kind of poetic justice in all of that. He tried to take a dishonest shortcut and ended up losing everything: his marriage, his house, his job, his new relationship. I, on the other hand, kept my house, my job, my dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing I stood up for myself and didn't let myself get stepped on. Yesterday, I was sitting on my balcony drinking coffee in the morning, something I do now that I never did before because I was always in a hurry, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt really happy to be exactly where I am, alone in my apartment that's completely mine, without having to worry about someone lying to me or betraying me. It's weird how something so devastating ends up being the push you needed to get your life back.